Hi, everyone. My name is Dinah Guzman. I'm a member of this wonderful autism and support group. I'm also a moderator, and I recently joined the mentor program. So I want to at least give a shout out to Nita um, and Linda for this wonderful group. I'm very grateful for them because I found this group at a time where I felt most isolated and lonely. And part of it is not having any peers to kind of bounce information back and forth. So, with that said, I'm a mother with two daughters, and they're both in their 30s. And I have my 17-year-old son, Nathaniel, who is my ASD child. He actually has dual diagnosis. He has Asperger syndrome and high functioning. So I wanted to just talk about, kind of my experience of what it was like for me being an older mom who also am raising three of my grandchildren. So I just wanted to kind of give some perspective of what it was like for me when I first got his diagnosis. And he's 17 now, like I said, but he is was actually diagnosed between the ages of 10 and 11. And his diagnosis, I want to say that it was a surprise when we got the diagnosis, but it really did have some things fell into place. It like clicked together. All the things that I had been seeing through his childhood that he was doing. And the reality is, if I had known then what I know now, I think things would have been a little bit different because more I would have been more aggressive in his diagnosis as far as like getting the help that he needed. And when I say that, it's, when you get your IEPs and you do all these things for your children to help them while they attend school, you really don't know all of the diagnosis and what's entailed. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. Sorry. I wanted to talk a little bit about that. With my son, it was at a traumatic time in our life when our diagnosis came to be. Isaiah, Adam, I'm sorry, this is my grandson, Adam, who happened to come and see me. Sorry. Go on down, babe. I fell in the pool. So then. I fell in the pool. Okay, babe. Sorry about that. So, again, talking about my son. So he had been experiencing some issues in school right about when he went into sixth grade. And first through fifth, he was doing relatively well. A matter of fact, he was doing well in school. He wasn't showing any signs of any difficulty, but he was showing lack of eye contact or just mannerisms that, I would look at it as being quirky. And because you love your kids, you really just kind of accept them for who they are. But it wasn't until he hit sixth grade, going on seventh grade, and I didn't realize that my son was being bullied in school. He wouldn't really say anything about it, and but he came home very stressful. He had high anxiety when he was younger. So some of the symptoms he carried from younger were high anxiety. He obsessed over things, had repetitive behaviors, and I really didn't put any of this together. Just kind of, since he's my first son, I just thought, okay, must be just a male thing going on. And I wasn't really sure. I just thought, well, okay, he'll grow out of certain characteristics, he'll grow out of certain things. And later, he wasn't growing out of them. So again, I didn't have any peers who I can talk to. I really didn't have family members who um, would be engaging in that. So I was really starting to feel isolated. Like, who can I talk to? Is this something common with boys? Is it, just all the kinds of questions. So his experience to being bullied caused him to have more of a higher anxiety. He had signs of depression, but you really don't know when they're depressed. Most kids go into their room, they just want to be left alone. So I just kind of looked at it like that. But it wasn't until my grandson, my sort of older grandson, went to the same school as my son, and they went on the same bus. And one day he came home and he said, "Grandma, the kids on the bus, they're mean to Nathaniel." And I said, "Nathaniel, what's happening? What's going on?" And he's like, "Oh, it's nothing that I can worry about." Well, it became severe. And so I also wanted to kind of comment and say that when our kids feel in certain ways, some of those stress levels, some of those feelings can manifest themselves into real physical ailments, stomach aches, headaches, just all kinds of like illnesses, not like colds or anything, just not feeling well. Can't really describe it. It could be like loose bowels, diarrhea, constipation. So they are real physical ailments that develop from all of these stress levels that they go through. So excuse me. So my son was feeling those things, although he was still wanted to go to school. He just was very stressful. I was getting complaints at the school that he would go use the washroom more. And matter of fact, it's very odd because during all this time, I had confronted the school and I had asked them what was going on and why certain things were occurring with my son. And they were like, well, we didn't hear any reports. We didn't hear anything. And then I got the phone call. That my son was being hospitalized because he had a full-blown meltdown. And it was taken that he was harmful to himself and to others. And so at that point, that probably was like the worst point in my life, to have a child that had to be admitted into a hospital because he was seen as a danger to himself or to others. And when I went there, I'm like, this is a life-changing situation. I was distraught. It was an emotional basket case. And I went there and I didn't know I didn't have the words to say to my son. And I didn't have any experience to help me engage with him. And I just kept asking him, like, what was wrong? What happened? And eventually, after he calmed down, he was able to talk to me. And he did say, Mom, I thought I can handle it, but I couldn't. And so I was angry. I did the whole 9 yards. I was a raving lunatic, after I got him admitted forcefully, because once SAS is called into the school system, it's like you don't really have a choice. So I got him fixed. I had to figure out what I was going to do. And I was like a bull in a china shop. I went after the school. I wanted answers. I wanted to know why these things happen. And it was in a classroom. So, dealing with something like that, you really don't know what to expect. You don't know who to blame. And you carry this guilt. Like, what could I have done differently? What could I have done to talk to someone? And so you have all these questions. It's a horrible feeling to have when you're not knowledgeable. And so through this, my son got his diagnosis in this way. So his diagnosis was Asperger syndrome and high functioning. And they started to say, well, he has OCD and STD and all of. I'm like, I'm sitting there and I'm trying to understand them. Like they're throwing the whole alphabet at me, and I don't understand any of it. And so I had to like stop them and say, you need to explain to me what all this means. What does it mean for my child, and how can I move forward in trying to help him? And of course, they're like, well, he has to stay here. He has to be tested. And I said, okay, I just thought you did all the testing. So they say, okay, it's going to be between 6 to 10 days to get the testing. So during that time, I had to rearrange my home. He was put on suicidal watch, which my son at that particular time felt distraught. But after he calmed down, he didn't feel that anymore, but I still had to monitor him just to make sure, because he didn't have the ability to express himself. So when I got this diagnosis, two things happened to me. Things clicked. All of a sudden, all of these things that I had seen my son do, like his obsessiveness with certain things, whether it was marbles or whether, it was he got very obsessed with the QVC channel and with infomercials, and he just did certain things that I just thought were quirky. But getting this diagnosis put all those pieces in perspective for me and said, okay, I didn't know that that was something wrong. Not that it's wrong, but I didn't know that that was formulating some kind of issue for my son. Because even and I can think back of when my son was in kindergarten, and the teacher, you go through these conferences and the teacher tells you, well, your son's lazy and he doesn't want to, doesn't put effort. And, you hear these things and you're like, okay, these are the things that we can fix at home. Well, when she said my son, out of all the things she was saying, said that my son was disrespectful, I was like, oh, wait a minute. My son is a very respectful kid. So how could this be? So I asked her, and she says, well, he's very rude. I'm talking to him and he doesn't look at me when I'm talking to him. And he doesn't know, he doesn't answer the questions properly. And he gets very upset when a routine is, not going well for him. And I thought of that conversation when I got the diagnosis for my son. And I thought, wow, here is some of the things, the symptoms to having Asperger's and high functioning. So I just want to throw out there, like my son would say, fun fact is that for some who don't know what Asperger's syndrome is, or the difference between Asperger's syndromes and high functioning, the biggest difference that those two diagnoses have is Asperger's syndrome is one that always the children are verbal. High functioning is different because you can be verbal or you could be nonverbal. So that is the only underlying difference, but everything else kind of blends together and melts together in those diagnoses. Children with Asperger's tend to have no language or speech delays. They have some cognitive development, and they do have some adaptive functioning. And you can see this in your children when they do this repetitive motion. For my son, he would, if you gave him too many things to do all at once, he would be just like very confused. And you'd have to say, okay, Nathaniel, I need you to do this first. And then afterwards, then you can do this. So you have to give them bits and pieces of what you want them to do so that they can kind of grasp the idea and then run with it. So after all of this had happened, I was more determined to help my son to kind of get more educated in what all of these things do, and how can I help him? So I wasn't worried about the diagnosis itself. I just felt like if I can empower myself with some knowledge, if I can find ways to help him. So my journey started right after when I was about to take my son out. So I didn't know this at the time. So it's very important when you fill out any information, you really do have to read those bottom lines. So they said 6 to 10 days after I talked to them. And on the 6th day, I was like, I'm going to get him. Called them up and I said, look, I'm going to come get my child. You said 6 days ago. Oh, no, Miss Guzman, you cannot do that. And I'm like, why can't I do that? And they were like, well, we want him to stay a little bit. We want him to try some medication on him. I'm like, well, why can't you do this outside of being here? I thought my son was more traumatized being in that facility because being 10 and 11, never being away from home, was traumatizing to me. And I will say it had to be traumatizing for him because they don't have any electronics during that time. They are just set in their rooms. They have certain times. And I definitely didn't want him to be on any medication until I knew exactly what it was and what the side effects were going to be. But they said, well, he's showing signs of depression. And we realized that he has PTSD. And so they started to tell me more about this diagnosis that they had went through after they did the assessment for ASD and Asperger's. And I said, well, I would be depressed too if I was stuck in a room and didn't have a telephone, a TV, any electronics to work with. He's 10 and 11. I don't understand. So through all that, it was very argumentative that day, but I was determined to take my son out of there. And so he said, well, let me call you back in like 15 minutes. Let me talk to my supervisor or whatever, he had to speak to. And he came back and he said, no, well, we want him to be in here for at least 10 days. And I said, let me tell you something. I am picking up my son today. And he's like, well, I don't think it's a good idea. I said, well, go tell your supervisor that if I don't get him home today, I am calling my insurance company today, and I'm going to tell them to deny any benefits, payments for any visits past today's date. He said, I'll call you back. It took him 10 minutes to call me back. And he said, okay, Miss Guzman, you can come pick up your child. We'll have to agree to having him come monitor. You can monitor him through monthly medical or medicine management. I said, fine. Took my son home, and I made a promise to him that I was going to advocate for his benefit, that he can tell me what he wanted, and I will help him go and get that. And since that day, that is what I was determined to do. And I attacked the problem that was at the school system and level. And mind you, that principal is no longer there. I can't say that I was the only contributing factor to that, because once I felt that this happened to my son under their care and supervision, I trusted them, and he was in a classroom and nobody saw anything, heard anything, because it was a mob mentality that told my son that he was disliked and should have killed himself. And that was a rage that I carried with me to motivate myself to be very forceful in the education system. And what that means is, when we had that IEP, I wanted them to actually put down his condition and his diagnosis and give him into services that he was going to need to help him through the trauma that the school calls for him. And of course, I had to be there more often, just to make sure that there wasn't any negative feedback from the staff. But Nathaniel did have special assistance during that time. So 7th grade, that's 8th grade. And then we start our journey into high school. And again, I didn't have any peers, because all my peers were now in retirement age, and so they were doing their own thing. They were out having a good time and vacationing, and I was raising kids. And my family, well, we had a lot of disagreements on things that I handled. For example, I'm the oldest of my family, and so I did functions at my house, and I did a lot of things. And during that time, I ended up having some issues with my oldest daughter, and that caused my three of my grandkids to live with me. And so that was a challenge in itself that I was facing, on top of my son and his um, trying to get him his self-esteem to come up, to get him to acknowledge that I wanted him to see himself in my eyes, that he was loved and he would be missed, and that I would hope that he would never want to ever feel like he had to, feel like he had to harm himself. And we did work through that. I mean, the first 3 months that he came back home, I moved a futon into his room, and I made it like, oh, Nathaniel, I just want to, watch TV with you. And if I fall asleep, it's okay. I'm laying on a bed anyway, kind of thing. And we did this for 3 months, just to kind of provide some security for myself. And then I realized that my son was feeling better about being home. We was able to kind of tell me some of the things that were going on, and working with the doctor. So he didn't want to go back to that place to get any therapy. So I called my insurance company, and we went, and they got me a good psychiatrist, medication management. Matter of fact, that is where my son's second diagnosis of high functioning came into play, and a much better understanding. So through it all, the doctor helped put him into therapy. So he had therapy twice a week, and it was aggressive, just to kind of get a good feeling about himself. And then the therapist, or the psychiatrist, was very open. He would call me into the office first, and he would ask me, like, what are the symptoms he's having, if there were any improvements. And through the blood work, we found out that my son had diabetes. So he put him on that medication. He provided some other medication to help him with his mood swings. And I think now that medication, he's at a good level. They're still low, and he's doing much better. It's going to be something that he's going to have to do, because depression, part of that diagnosis, is something that is a lifelong symptom to have. And it's not something that goes away, just like autism doesn't go away, and Asperger's doesn't go away. And we're not trying to look for a cure, but we are trying to give them a quality of life. And if that means medication for him, then that was my personal choice. And it did well for him, and he is on that. So now we have the new journey of going into high school, which, Nita, I'm sure you're thinking about all these wonderful things. And so my son was like, I think I'm going to be okay. I said, Nathaniel, it's a new experience. It's new people. They won't know you. It's a clean slate. You'll do well. And he did. My son began to, he was always in the band. My son wasn't a contact sport kind of a kid, so he wasn't doing sports. He was more, he loved band, so he plays a euphonium, and he loves to sing. So he did do activities, and he did have lots of friends. And so the challenge for my son was the social emotional portion of the diagnosis. Like, he had friends, but the hardest part for him is to maintain that friendship. Like, he doesn't understand, like, call your friends and just see how they're doing. Like, why? Like, why do I need to do that? They know, I know they're good. I know but I would say, like, no, that's the whole point of having friends. You keep friends if you keep in contact with them. Like, sometimes it's nice to just say, hi, how you doing? So we struggle with that. And that is the diagnosis for Asperger's. And a lot of kids on the spectrum is that they have difficulty with social emotional um, issues, just dealing with normal life. I mean, my son learned, and this is where we say adaptive functioning, is that my son, when that teacher told me that my son was disrespectful, and and here's exactly what my son said. I said, Nathaniel, why aren't you looking at the teacher when you talk to them? And he said, Mom, I listen with my ears. Why do I need to look at them too? And I was just like, well, that's true. You listen with your ears, but it's a mutual respect for you to give eye contact. And he struggled with that all the time. So I worked with him. And I said, look, Nathaniel, just so that people know that you are listening, because that's really the main factor, is that you are giving people the attention when they're talking to you, so they know that you are understanding what they're saying. Look at them, but why don't you focus, like maybe the ear or the top of their forehead, or try to do that. And it worked for my son. He looks like he's talking, like he's listening, but I know even when I talk to him, that he's listening, but he just can't give me that straight eye contact. Sometimes he has good days, but he's such a funny kid that he'll give me a funny face, and I stop in my tracks, kind of figure out what was I saying. So he does have a very good sense of humor. It's very sarcastic, and I wonder where he gets that, but I know it's from me. But I wanted to just touch base because I know that a lot of parents might be feeling the same way, where you struggle to understand why they do certain things or why they say certain things, but it has to really do with um, like the cognitive ability. And I know that we had a video on executive functioning, but these are two elements that really affect high functioning and children with Asperger's. And I say that because when they have those two diagnoses, it's very common for kids to be misdiagnosed, because first it's looked at, is this a learning disability? Is this a behavior disability? Or is it an emotional disability? And so my son, who went through first to sixth grade, did not have an IEP, wasn't viewed as having any learning disabilities, because he was on track. And even when he was younger, he was meeting his goals, and did have, like normal trajectories when it came to um, being able to move on. He did have some issues with structure, meaning he liked it. And so when the school setting changes to having table settings where you move to different areas, or even moving out of a classroom, that would kind of make him a little kind of out of sorts. But he learned to adapt to that. And here's a good example of adaptation, is so in school, he's able to follow the school schedule. He's able to maneuver around the school. He's able to find out where his classrooms are, and get to his class. He knows there's a bell. He knows what he has to do. The problem is that my son just felt like I have to take all my books with me, and he wouldn't put things in his locker. And he said to me, he says, Mom, I don't even know where my locker is. And I said, Nathaniel. And he would say, well, I don't want to wear a winter coat because I can't walk around school without it. I said, well, put it in your locker. He goes, I never go to my locker. So that was my dilemma with my son carrying like 50 pounds, 60 pounds of books every day to every single class, and to try to get him to understand, like, you can't keep doing that. So we struggle with a lot of things. Now, mind you, he can do the school schedule, he can manipulate to the school, but I had put up a goal, kind of a goal sheet for him to kind of help him to try to attain some life skills. And so part of that was, remembering personal hygiene, brushing your teeth, and all the wonderful things that come with it. And then to be on spot with his medication management. So he knows that he has to take medication in the morning. He knows that he has to take medication at night and some midday, but that's, a different thing. So I got a pill box, and I had morning and I had evening, and I set him in. Now I can tell him 100 times what his medication is and what it's for. He understands what it's for, but I could never give him a pill bottle and say, put your medication in your, your medication box. He would not be able to do that. It would take time for that repetitiveness to finally click in, which is something we're still working with because, the unforeseen things that happen. I'm like, well, close to my 60s, and we all have that thought process of what are we going to do with our kids, or what's going to happen with them when we're no longer there, or who will take care of them. So those were just some of the things that I, try to put on this goal sheet, was for him to look at it and kind of work through it. But it's not like the schedule at school. I still have to remind him, like, Nathaniel, did you take your meds? Nathaniel, so it's a struggle. It's a hard task to get him to understand. He knows what it is, but it's like that delayed, like he just won't do it. And some days he's good. He's like, Mom, I took my meds. I'm like, oh, hallelujah, you did that. So now he's 17. He's a junior in high school. He's done really, really well. But he has an IEP to help him through that. And he is in general population for 60 to 75% of the day. Then he has what they're called a lesser program, which means he gets a normal school schedule, but it's with less children in the classroom so that he can function better. He doesn't have all this loud noise going on, which is part of it. And what I learned that my son had, he's good with crowds to a certain point, even with his friends. And so when he would have social settings with his friends, I noticed that he would start to move away and kind of still be in the whole group. And some of the friends who he really knew, who started school with him from kindergarten on to even now, they just kind of accepted him. Now, there are kids that don't, and there are kids that do. And so I always try to tell my son, try to be with the kids that accept you for who you are. And so the first 2 years while he was in high school, he was more or less sitting alone in the lunchroom. And when my oldest grandson went to the same school, he would say, "Why, Nathaniel, why do you sit alone?" And he's like, well, it was his way of regenerating. He was in a classroom, it's loud, the hallways are loud. And he just told me, Mom, I feel like a battery that, I start out at full, 100%, but so much activity and everything that's going on, my battery, I just feel like it goes low, and I just need some quiet time, whether it's sitting, by myself, not really having to talk to anyone, just kind of like to get myself together so that I can go to my next class. Or he'd say, I just had to go to the nurse's office, get a drink of water because I just needed some quiet time. So, my son was learning good coping skills instead of, having a meltdown or kind of like, really demonstrating some really hard feelings, which is another issue because they are so honest. My son, not trying to hurt anyone's feelings, would just really just give it to you. He would say how he felt, or if he thought something didn't look right, or and very rule regulated. And he would get upset if someone cheated, just jokingly or whatever. That's not the rules, he'd say, and he'd get very upset. And so those were all signs that he was demonstrating when he was younger, but I never really put that together. He wasn't a bad sport, but he just wanted people to follow the rules. And so that was part of it. And so now my challenge, I have, I'm not sure if I mentioned, but I have two older daughters and they're in their 30s, and my son who's 17, but I also have an older grandson who's 17, like my son. So I had a shared pregnancy with my daughter. Wasn't fun, but it happened. And so he has, they have all been raised together. Even my three grandchildren now have all been raised together. So he has a good support system with um, his nephews. As far as they know how he is, my oldest grandson can more or less calm my son down when he feels like he's ribbing up. And he almost has an oil and water relationship with my grandson Rudy, and that's only because they're two peas in a pod. And so that is pretty much basically, part of my son struggle through the lower grades. And it's gotten better, but it's been a ride for him. There's some trauma that he deals with, but he's doing so much better in that. And that's a lot of our goals, is to just, get our children to a point where they can be, self-sufficient, know our limits, know their limits. And that's what I had to do. That diagnosis put things into perspective for me. It really made me think that, if my son doesn't feel comfortable having tons of people over the house, then guess what? I'm just not going to have as many parties, or I'm just going to be more, more, uh, I'm sorry. I was going to be more cautious about the things that were going to be disruptive for my son. And that meant, getting people angry and, not having as many family members over. And I think part of it is I wanted my family to be a part of my journey. And I felt they weren't being supportive in a way that would benefit my son. And almost to the point where it was like, well, he may not like going to the show. Well, why wouldn't he like going to the show? He doesn't have a meltdown. It's not like anything's going to happen. But that's what happened when you get that diagnosis and you tell someone. They automatically feel, well, is it contagious? Like they're not. This is what not being educated in these certain things does to people. And I would say my generation, that we didn't have diagnosis like, autism, or everything was chalked up to a learning disability. So more people have that common distinction. Their thought minds are at that level. And until they realize that a child does not have to look in whatever mindset these people think that they should look to have a disability or have, ASD. Like, we can live normal lives. My son lives a normal life. Everyone is living a normal life to a certain extent. Our struggle is real. I mean, we do things, excuse me, we struggle with the inevitable, I want to say. And when I say that, it's only because there are just things in our children's life that we can't control, and neither can they. And so when that diagnosis clicked, it clicked that, one, I was going to be an advocate for my son, and I was going to learn as much as I can learn to get me through this and get him through this, and then maybe help someone else who I didn't have the opportunity to have during the time that I was going through something. And so I'm very glad that I got the opportunity to find this group, because it did give me that motivation. It made me feel less isolated and lonely. And I realized that I was not the only one that was going through some of these things. I have a different perspective because now I have two of my younger grandkids on the spectrum. They're high functioning. So I get an opportunity to see high functioning, and I get to see a little bit of Asperger's and high functioning. So, and they do have very different needs. So we're not, accumulating all of these things and saying, oh, everybody's the same. No, this is my personal journey. And just the things that my son has gone through is a journey that can be very similar to someone else's experience. And I just thought I wanted to be able to share some of this to help someone who may be going through it. And then also, I wanted to kind of say how it's important that when your kids are demonstrating some physical elements to what anxiety can bring, what are signs of some depression, or even stress, anxiety, all of these things. I mean, they surface and manifest in real physical conditions. They are stomach aches. I mean, there is a lot of things that our children who, and I don't want to say there's a difference between verbal and nonverbal, because your child can be verbal just like mine. It just could not put the words together to describe what he was feeling. And he still doesn't. He has a hard time being able to say, Mom, this is what I'm feeling, but he can gauge it more or less and try to explain, because he always speaks of grandeur. Like, it's never a molehill, it's always a mountain. So I always have to kind of like bring him off the ledge, sort of, not in that way, but in the context of, okay, let's look at it differently. And I also wanted to mention that when I was taking my son to the doctor, you kind of rely on the pediatricians to tell you, they're the professionals. Like when my son was walking on his tippy toes, or he was having leg pains, or he kept saying my back hurt or my stomach hurt, and I would take him and I would say, what's wrong? He has these ailments. I don't know what it is. He seems fine. And they would be like, oh, it's just normal. It's growing pains. He'll be okay. And then when all of this happened in 6th and 7th grade, my son started to really complain about having pains in his back. He said, Mom, it feels like my back is collapsing on itself. And so again, the description always, is difficult when you don't really know what really hurts. And so again, I take him to the doctor. I would, talk to the doctor, and I said, there's got to be something wrong. Like he just can't be in pain just to be in pain. Oh, he's too young, they would say. And here's the thing, once they get that diagnosis, I think most doctors, they just kind of steer away, they ignore it, and they feel, well, this kid doesn't really know what they're talking about. I mean, they really, I think, push those, you know, symptoms away and kind of just make it seem like, oh, it'll get better. And they really just feed you a bunch of bull about things will get better, because half the time there's something seriously going on. And so you have to pursue that. And so I went, from the pediatrician, they're not giving me the answers that I need. They're not really, my son is still in pain. I don't understand why. And then last year, it's been a year now, last year, my son woke up and just couldn't walk anymore. And, he was saying my back hurt, my legs. I thought it was sciatica. I thought he had hurt himself doing something, because he does marching band. And an euphonium weighs 50 pounds. And I thought, okay, he just threw his back out. You'll be okay. Here, this is a Band-Aid effect. Here's you give them a heating pad, you give them some Aleve, and you work it out, because you're looking at their youth. You're thinking they're young. You shouldn't have any, I don't know what you're complaining about. You should, be able to deal with these things. And one day he was like, Mom, I can't get up. He started crying. He said, my legs hurt, my back hurts. And when he said, Mom, I need to go to the emergency room, I need to see somebody, I knew then that my son was not playing, that he was experiencing pain. And so I took him to the emergency room, and he got x-rays taken, and they were like, well, his back is okay. And they gave him some pain meds, and my son still had pain. And I go, wait, that's not really good. If he still is feeling pain, then we should do something else. So the doctor prescribed an MRI. And lo and behold, my son was found to have 3 herniated discs, and he had spinal stenosis, which, okay, I was angry because I had just taken him to the doctor who took me, who sent me to other specialists, and they were like, he's fine. Then I go to the emergency room and he's not fine. So again, I was just very upset. Like, here, they didn't take my son seriously. They weren't taking me serious. They just figure, this is another thing. So my son got treated for that. That's his diagnosis now. So I think that he's dealing with more of the pain symptoms, to the effect of the herniated disc and the spinal stenosis. It's something now that we have to add to the list of things that he has to navigate himself. Now, my son's, it's not a disease, it's just a condition which the doctor said could have been a defective birth. And really, doctors don't administer MRIs because they want to. It has to happen through something like this. So that put things into perspective. Again, it's a clicking into what you knew was something wrong, and all of a sudden you're given a diagnosis, and then you're like, oh my gosh, that's what it was. So that's what the diagnosis for my son was for me. It was getting information so that I can help my son, so I can help myself. Because really, if I didn't have the ability to be strong, how can I be strong for my son? And so I really had to sit myself down. I had to say, okay, he needs me, I need him. And so I was going to do the best I could for him during the time that he needed me. And so that is a lot of what a lot of us parents do now. We kind of work together. We give advice. We, share common events. And I think that's one of the resources that this support group does for us. And I have learned a lot of things that I didn't know. And, it opens an opportunity for you to get more information about subjects or topics or anything else. So I thought for my son, I wanted to challenge him, and so I put him into group therapy. It didn't turn out well for him because for some reason, and I don't really know why they do this, but when they have group therapy, they put a bunch of kids together who have very similar traits, and it was very hard to distinguish amongst themselves. Now, if you have kids who find it hard to socialize and you put them into a group setting, there's not much talking going on. They don't have an ability to go, oh, hey, some are more outgoing than others. My son wasn't. I mean, you really have to jab him a couple of times to get him to have a conversation. But the problem is that if you talk about a topic that he likes, there it is. It will be hours of talking. And so part of this is not knowing the social cues, which is why it's hard for the kids to understand when they're being bullied, is because they don't really take what they're saying as, they brush it off. They just don't, it doesn't matter at that point until it becomes more physical or something where they're like, oh, hey, there's something going on. And so my son doesn't understand those social cues either. I mean, I could be on the phone, I could be doing work, and he'll bring his phone and he'll put it right into my face. And he goes, look, Mom, this is what I was talking to you about, or this is what I, wanted you to see. And I would be like, Nathaniel, did you not see what I was doing? He goes, oh yeah, I'm sorry. And then he'll put it back in my face. And so do I give in and go, okay, let me see what you're doing? I would, and I do. And I'll say afterwards, Nathaniel, next time if I'm doing something, ask me if I can see it or if I have time to do it. And so every now and then he'll pop up and he goes, Mom, do you have time to see this video? Mom, do you? Like, okay, give me 5 minutes, give me 10 minutes. And oh, I better be in 5 minutes down there because he'll stand wherever I am and he'll show me, he's like, we were going to watch this. And so I have to do that with him. But he's a funny kid. he has matured in a lot of ways, but still has a lot of, I don't want to say childlike abilities, but he likes to just do silly things that make me laugh and make others laugh. And he, it's hard for him to understand, like, he is a pleasurable person to be around. And I think sometimes you have to continue to encourage them in many ways, especially when their anxieties hit. So, for example, my son, when we moved to this area, every Tuesday they would do testing. And so alarms would ring off, and we're close to the school. And so every Tuesday at 10 o'clock, the alarms would go off. And my son would be like, oh my God, it's a tornado, or, it's something, there's something going on. I would calm him down. And he's like, oh no, we're not even prepared. So what I did with him, I got a box and I said, okay, Nathaniel, here's what we're going to do. Take this box, write a list of all the things that we're going to need in case there's a hurricane or there's a tornado, that we will call this our emergency box. And everything, a flashlight, a blanket, some canned food, whatever you think fits in this box. If you feel that there's something in there that you want to put in, do it. And we'll take it downstairs and we'll call, it our emergency box. And in the event that an alarm really happens, we are going to be prepared, just to lessen his anxiety. So sometimes it's giving in to some of these whims just to get them to feel safer, more comfortable, as quirky or as crazy it may be. Sometimes you just have to give in to some of these urges, because it's compulsory. They will continue to ask you and ask you, like, over and over again, until you decide to go, okay, I'm going to do it. So every time my son felt some type of anxiety towards something, I would help him engage in an activity that would help him to lessen his fears, his anxieties. And because really, I don't know where they come from. He doesn't know where they come from, but it's just waking up with nightmares. Which is one of the reasons he was having. So it was traumatic after the bullying. It was nightmares after that, and worrying because the kids would come up behind him and push him or hit him, and you turn around and there's no one's there. So he developed that PTSD through that specific those specific things that were happening. It's always wondering, like, oh, you got to watch my back. I got to do these things. He's better now. He doesn't have to fear that. But, he still kind of remembers those things, and we have to talk it through and tell him that things are going to get better. And so he does. He surprises me. So in a lot of ways, I try to keep pushing him towards some real life situations, like driving school. I don't know. I know I posted something about that, but that whole thing about when they said, okay, in sophomore year he was going to get driver's ed, I thought, oh my God, I was already seeing what it was like teaching my older girls, and that was traumatic in myself. I think that gave me more gray hair than anything, just trying to teach them. And so I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to need to take high blood pressure medicine or whatever to teach my son. And so here you have to get your permit before you can get your the driver's instruction. So I got a book for Nathaniel, and I gave it to him. This was like March. It was like May. And so school didn't start until the beginning or midway of August. So we had the book from May until like May 31st or something. Noah! And Noah! Stop yelling, babe. Sorry. So I gave him the book, and I said, okay, Nathaniel, you're going to have to read the book and learn the signs and everything else, so that, come on, Grandma. Okay, wait, babe. So that we would, sorry about that. So we would be able to, start you on, you need to have 50 hours of driving and stuff. And so we hadn't done that, and it was getting close to the time. School was starting, and they started to give you the emails letting you know that school was starting and they needed to have these criterias for the classroom. So here I go. I'm trying to teach him around here. So first 2 weeks it was driving up and reversing. My son can only go into the driveway. So it's up the driveway and then back up the driveway. Eventually I got enough nerve to be able to, excuse me, to be able to get him past the street and 2 blocks, 3 blocks, and give him more motivation towards that. So he passed. So we're taking him to go so he can get the his permit. So he has to do the testing and stuff. And I spent 2 days because I had said to my son, "Did you follow up? Did you work on the book?" And he was like, "Oh, was I supposed to?" And I was like, "Oh my God, we got like less than a week and school's gonna start." So it was rigorous 2 days, taking him in. I was a nervous wreck and he was calm and cool and whatever. And we get there and it's a funny thing because their perspective is different than ours. Needless to say, he put me through some worries. He did pass it, and so that was one more thing under his belt. And then he said to me, he goes, "Mom, you know what? I just wanted to do it. I'm not really interested in driving." I was like, "What?" So that's where we are now. We are, he has his permit. He'll probably have to do it over to begin to, get it into perspective. But these are just some of the things that some of our kids are going to be able to do. And so sticking with them, teaching them patience, lots of patience. And then for a parent, I would say that, if you know your limits, if you know that there is going to be something that you're not going to be able to handle, don't feel bad about that. I want, for me, I had to learn what my limits were. I had to understand what my capabilities were. And I was not going to stress over a family who didn't want to be here or didn't want to engage. And I wasn't going to feel bad for myself because that didn't happen. And I think it's made me a much better, happier person, just in itself, to be able to shake some of that and just do for my son and my grandkids. So I wanted to share that a little bit with you all, about what it was for me, or what it still is, because I'm still raising 2 small ones, 6 and 7, who are on the spectrum, and learning how I can help them as well. So I didn't, I know that my time's almost up, and I want to thank everyone for listening to me. I hope it wasn't rambling. I hope I provided some information that will help someone to feel better about some of those guilty feelings we have, the wheres, the hows, the whys, that we can't control those. And that's, what I want to be able to leave everyone with, that note that we are a support group, and we learn from each other, and makes us much better people for it. So I'm having a hard time reading some questions of everyone. Thank you, Lorianda. It's hard to see on my little phone, like names and stuff, but thank you very much. So I think my time is up. Nita, if you're still there, can... Hi, Linda. Thank you. Sorry, with my phone, I can't see questions, or I can't see other people on here. But I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to give some of my experience. I have a lot of them, so maybe I'll do another focus live on what it is to have my grandchildren with ASD. Who knows? Thank you very much, though, for joining. I think my time is up.